think we can get started. Good morning. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm joined by three experts today to whom I'm very grateful for taking the time to talk about this issue. We will be discussing the Russia-Ukraine crisis, of course. Let me introduce the speakers, and then we'll just get into our discussion. We're going to keep this conversational. So I want to encourage our attendees to use the Q&A feature to submit their questions, and I will get to as many of them as I can, I promise. So first, here we have Katharine Quinn-Judge, who is an analyst based in Kiev, Ukraine. Her work is focused on the war in Donbass, regional security, and ethnography of conflict, and she serves as the consulting senior analyst in Ukraine with the International Crisis Group. We also have Michael Kofman, who serves as the director of the Russia Studies program at CNA and is also a fellow at Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And we have Rob Lee, who is a fellow at in our Eurasia program at FPRI. He's a PhD student researching Russian defense policy at King's College London War Studies Department. So with that, I want to start with Katharine and ask her, because she is in Ukraine, to tell us a little bit about what the situation is like on the ground, what she's seeing, what she's hearing, and how people in Ukraine feel about the current crisis. Thank you, Katharine.
Okay. Thank you, Maya, for that introduction, and thank you for having me today. Please enjoy this view of the Kiev skyline and of my cats, who are also from Kiev. So I would say, the mood on the ground in Kiev has certainly shifted in the past few weeks. Outwardly, there are no clear changes. There's still traffic jams and people partying and neighbors screaming at each other and then making up immediately afterwards. But when it comes to sort of discourse, things have shifted, right? So even just among sort of my friend group, these obsessive conversations about like, oh, is there going to be a war? Is there not going to be a war? I don't think there's going to be a war. Maybe there's going to be a war. These conversations are pretty all present now. So then there's also the mood at the front line in Ukrainian controlled areas, and I can speak a bit to that. I was last week in frontline sections of Luganska Oblast and the Donetsk city suburbs, so areas near Avdiivka, Maidanka, and sort of opposite Gorlovka, which is one of the hardest hit cities on the DNR controlled side. There, the mood is, I would describe the mood as stable bad. I've been seeing quite a bit of Western coverage of the situation on the front line that implies that there's sort of a sea change taking place there. Articles with titles like, in the trenches, soldiers brace for possible attack. And I really didn't see that dynamic there. I'll even say that one of the articles that was in fact titled something like, in trenches in Lugansk, soldiers brace for possible attack. That was written on an expedition to the trenches that I was present for. And the account of the situation there just did not match what I saw at all. And I saw people who were sick of the monotony of the war, who were going crazy from, the isolation and the indeterminacy of the situation. But I did not meet people who sensed that there was an escalation afoot yet. There were certainly people who felt that they were ready for an escalation, who perhaps might actually prefer that an escalation occurred, to sort of lessen the uncertainty and to sort of lessen this agony of waiting all the time. But there wasn't a sense that there was sort of, that there were real kinetic changes afoot. It's changed slightly in the past few days. There have been more ceasefire violations. There was a death among the DNR fighters today that the DNR spokespeople are reporting pretty prominently. But generally, the dynamics of the fighting sort of there isn't yet any clear change. I can also speak a bit to the public mood in the non-government controlled areas of Donbass, the areas under the control of the so-called DNR and LNR, Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, which are, as we know, backed by Russia, controlled by Russia, however you want to call it. There, it's actually been really interesting to hear people speak about their perception of the situation. Again, sort of the prospect of war, the possibility of a bigger war has entered discourse there. But what people say is that if they weren't reading the news, and in some cases, if they weren't talking to their relatives in Kiev, they wouldn't know that anything had changed. They don't see, despite the sort of proclamations of the de facto authorities that, Kiev is about to launch an offensive and, we really are going to need Russia's help very soon. De facto authorities are apparently, for example, just not taking any efforts to survey bomb shelters. From what we hear, military mobilization doesn't really seem to have ticked up, although I hear some sort of mixed things about that. And until today, there were no sort of major warnings to the population. To the effect that people needed to be prepared, which had occurred in many times in the past ahead of security scares that turned out to be overblown or that didn't materialize. And then finally, I want to sort of note a shift perhaps in the mood among the Russian-backed fighters, several of whom are acting strangely optimistic and excited. One, for example, Alexander Khodakovsky, who's the former head of the Vostok Battalion, is saying that, basically posting that he's, it's been a long time since he's felt so optimistic, and since he's felt that Donbass's position is so strong when compared to that of Ukraine. Basically, he was sort of projecting the view that essentially, whatever Donbass wants to do at this point, whatever the so-called separatists want to do at this point, Russia will back them up and that they have nothing to fear, which is pretty striking given that the messages coming from these people tend to be more of the sort of the bent that, where they emphasize the fact that they're the outnumbered side compared to the Ukrainians, and sort of, put out a lot of sort of dire signals about the need for more Russian help. So the optimism that you're hearing from the Russian-backed fighters at this point is really, it's pretty striking. I think that's maybe the sort of most worrying factor that I've been picking up on.
Right. Thank you so much, Katharine. Rob, I want to turn it over to you. We know that especially since Moscow made the ultimatum to NATO, essentially demanding these security guarantees that would ensure that NATO gives these promises that it does not enlarge and to include Ukraine or Georgia. We know that Washington and NATO have been looking for diplomatic solutions, and they're still hoping for a diplomatic solution. On Wednesday, they sent these letters to Moscow parallel to each other, which is a response to this draft treaty that Moscow presented on December 17th. You wrote an article for FPRI recently where you argue that the costs of inaction for Moscow are greater than the costs of an escalation. Can you tell us a little bit about why you feel that way and how you see whether or not this full-out war is actually likely?
Sure. So, I hope some people read my article. I guess to give a short summary of it, the kind of three main elements of it. One is that identify that Russia's strategy right now is part of a compellence campaign, and basically, what we're seeing right now, it's a continuation of the buildup that occurred last spring, began last March and April. I argue that was mostly about deterrence. You look at over the summer and the fall. There was increased NATO defense cooperation in Ukraine. There was the HMS Defender incident. There was a TB2 strike. It's the unmanned aerial vehicle that Ukraine has on the Donbass for the first time. So a number of events that I think Russia was really upset about, which kind of led to the second buildup. And what I argue is that the first initial build in the spring is more of the deterrence. This one became about compellence. So basically, Russia was failing to achieve its objectives, and so it started to kind of escalate. And so this time, we saw specific ultimatums, specific demands, a deadline that's attached to it, a commitment to military technical response if they didn't receive kind of those demands, and then a huge military buildup, really unprecedented military buildup, which we continue to see. A lot of it is unprecedented, and so all those kind of things were a really big departure from things that we've seen before. I also and because I think it's about compellence. I think I think Russian officials, they've kind of boxed themselves in the corner by making these demands, making this a credibility issue for themselves, and that if they don't get a concession, which they really haven't gotten any significant concessions so far, that basically they're left with nothing else to do except for to escalate and use military force. And so I think what they've been trying to do is initially it was trying to negotiate with Kyiv. I think from their perspective, they at this point come to the realization they don't think there's any real prospects for negotiating with Kyiv about the Donbass situation, about implementing the Minsk agreements. They then hope that the Normandy format, that France and Germany would kind of force Ukraine to make certain changes that they wanted. That hasn't happened. And so what we've seen in the fall is really been a focus on the U.S. trying to get the Biden administration to force Ukraine to make these kind of concessions to them. That hasn't happened. And the most recent kind of response to the U.S. has made that pretty clear. And so basically Russia's been signaling is that, well, if the U.S. does not force Ukraine to make these changes, then we will do so with military force, and that'll be through compellence and about through escalating and using an escalating amount of kind of inflicting pain on Ukraine until it changes the cost-benefit analysis of Kyiv to say, you know what, it is less painful to make these kind of really unpalatable political concessions than to keep be on the receiving end of kind of military force. And so the third part of my argument or article is basically looking kind of the military options, and that's an area where Mike and I have somewhat of disagreement. I think the other parts we're pretty on the same page. I personally thought, and part of this is difficult because we're seeing is so unprecedented that it's really difficult to look at previous templates of when Russia's used military force and say, okay, how will they use military force this time? Well, it's easy if the situation is similar. In this case, it's already dissimilar. And on one hand, the 2008 war, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, when they intervened in Syria in 2015, in each case there was an external catalyst that kind of led to that Russian reaction. This time, there is obviously an external catalyst, but it's not as kind of direct, not as obvious. It's kind of something where it's really Russia making a decision. Okay, we're trying to force this issue now. We don't get our demands, then we're going to escalate. That it would be a marked departure from previous uses of force, and that's why it's really difficult to look at those previous uses of force and say, okay, what will Russia do this time? Well, it's because so much is unprecedented. There is the possibility that what they'll do in the future may not look like what they've done in the past. And so I think that's really one of the big points of kind of diversion, I think, or of disagreement between some of the articles that have come out. I think I certainly think that Russia most likely uses military force because no concessions are occurring, and I think they think that's the most likely way of achieving their goals. I think that's a number of people agree on that, but how they'll use military force, what exactly military objectives they'll have, I think there's some disagreement there. My view is that the most likely thing we'll see is that we'll see a kind of an enhanced, more aggressive version of what Russia did in the 2008 war, where it could be a heavy use of artillery fires, which Russia has a really significant military advantage in compared to Ukraine. It will focus on inflicting pain on the Ukrainian military, destroying units, inflicting casualties, taking POWs, and then it could involve a planned withdrawal after a week or two. It might be able to achieve their objectives that easily, or it will involve kind of a movement toward Kyiv without necessarily trying to occupy that much Ukraine, because I don't think they really want to occupy the cities and the things that make a kind of invasion more difficult. So that's my view. There's some disagreement there, and Michael mentioned kind of his view on it. The big thing I'll say is that, again, because so much is unprecedented, there's a lot of uncertainty, and so it's hard to come out and say we could very effectively predict what Russia's going to do because the situation is quite different. So it's quite concerning. there really aren't that any obvious off ramps. I think the main problem for Russia is that this is about Ukraine. It's really not. They've made a number of demands towards NATO. A lot of those demands are important issues for Russia, but they're a little bit peripheral to the current problem. They're not pressing. The pressing issues about Ukraine, and ultimately, even if NATO makes a variety of concessions, but Ukraine continues to not implement the Minsk agreements to their satisfaction and continues to increase their conventional deterrence by seeking long-range weapon systems and other kind of military equipment. Basically, the situation is going to be the status quo will not be acceptable from Russia's perspective, and so the risk of an escalation will still be there. And unfortunately, I don't think there are any obvious off ramps at this point, and that leads us in a really kind of tough position.
Rob, thank you for that summary. I want to turn it over to Michael. I pasted the link to Michael's recent War on the Rocks article in the chat box for everyone to see also, because I'll be referring to that. Michael, before I turn it over to the military options, because I do have questions about that, I want to quickly address, there's a section in your article that answers the question that I've been asking for a really long time, and that is why now? Because on the surface, it seems like, these demands came out of nowhere. NATO hasn't been, in the process of welcoming Ukraine to its ranks. So sort of from afar, it seems the timing seems confusing. But I feel like in that section, you really addressed that question quite nicely. Do you mind giving us a little bit of background on that? I think our audience would benefit from that. And then I want to ask you about the military options.
Sure. I think it's important to reflect on the fact that this is about Ukraine, right? But it's not just about Ukraine. It's also about Ukraine and NATO in Ukraine, and fundamentally about the security architecture, Europe and Russia's position in that security order post-Cold War. So when we sort of try to discuss this about Ukraine, or it's about these bigger grand strategic issues and long-term 30-year run grievances, the answer to both is unfortunately yes, because the situation lies at the intersection of those two big Venn diagrams. So if we look at kind of proximate causes, right, we probably can find two intersecting strands. The first is a series of actions in 2020, right? Russians were really optimistic when Zelensky came to office. They thought that he was going to be a sort of peace candidate. They had negotiations. They thought it was a good prospect for compromise with him. That was his platform. It was clear, I think, from the Russian point of view, that unfortunately, they reached an impasse over negotiations over Minsk, right? Zelensky essentially made clear that, okay, he's not willing to make the compromises essentially along the lines of Russia's position. More importantly, he began to go after Russia's influence in Ukraine in 2020, right? He had arrested Medvedchuk, Putin's ally there. He banned several pro-Russian TV channels. And there was a host of actions that began to show clearly to Moscow that not only was it losing Ukraine, but as Russia's previous strategy for Ukraine post-2014 had just fundamentally failed. And that's acknowledged, actually, I think, across the board in Russian lead. If you read Putin's article on Ukraine last July, you'll see towards the end of it where he begins to say, I don't think Ukraine really wants the Donbass back. My strategy of occupying the Donbass and leveraging that for negotiations with Ukraine, he doesn't say it literally, but it's very clear. There's sort of an epiphany in that article. I don't think this is going to work anymore, right? And the other part is Zelensky's clearly coming after Russian influence in Ukraine. So Russian influence, political influence in Ukraine is declining, and Ukraine is on this westward march. Now we overlay that slightly with this bigger strategic issue, right? Which is the Russian perception that even though NATO enlargement for Ukraine is not on the table, NATO is increasingly treating Ukraine as a NATO member. The United States is using Ukrainian territory for bomber overflights, ISR overflights. There are more trainers. There's more structural cooperation. There's a large British deal to build naval bases and facilities. So there's more capabilities being procured by Ukraine, whether it's from Britain, from Turkey, from the United States. And there's a steady perception that this whole thing is going on a particular trajectory. When leaders think about the decision to use force, they don't think of it as a preferable option. It's not a choice between using force and not using force, right? What really happens in that decision-making process is first they think about what are the costs of using force versus the costs of inaction. And I think on the Russian side, they begin to see that the costs of doing nothing over time are rising. But second, and that's the more important point, they begin to wonder and rationalize whether or not use of force is inevitable. That is, they don't see a political solution coming out of this. And they begin to wonder if it's cheaper and less risky to use force now than to do it later. And once leaders begin to think the use of force is going to be inevitable, right? They're going to have to eventually use force to resolve this crisis. Then they start a very interesting rationalization conversation with themselves, right? About maybe it's better to actually conduct a military operation today, even though it would be very costly and it would be rather risky compared to further down the line. So I think that's how we got to it now. I may have slight differences with Rob. Some of them are kind of a narcissism of small differences, but I generally think, so the spring buildup last spring, how this all began, it looked like a case of cursive diplomacy, but there was one big problem with that story. Russia didn't want anything. So usually when people engage in cursive diplomacy, they make demands. And they forgot to make any of these demands of the United States, especially when they came to the summit with Biden. Putin forgot to ask for any of these things, right? What were the demands of the Russian spring buildup? So Russia issued red lines and they wanted to get a conversation, but there weren't any of these clear demands coming out of it, right? And we know some forces were left back, particularly 41st Army. So they were clearly hedging and already putting the units slowly in place for a follow-on buildup. My general sense of it is that they were looking to see how the United States and how Zelensky would react, but that they have spent a year building the military option, right? And whether or not they've chosen it, of course, is up to debate. I have my clear position where I think they were leaning towards it from the very beginning and looking to see if there were ways that they could achieve political aims just through the buildup and negotiation. But my personal view is that the demands you've seen come out in November, well, I'll summarize it this way. First, very clearly Russian improvised, right? It's quite obvious that they did not have the intention to make these demands earlier in the year when they could have. Second, strangely, have nothing to do with the fundamental problem that Russia has in Ukraine. Nothing about Minsk II, nothing about settlement of the occupied territories in Donbass, or how Russia can get out of sanctions or resolution of this problem, which is fundamental. It's not anywhere in the demands, not to the United States, not to NATO. And part three, the demands, as you know, particularly on security guarantees, which they're very interested in, they're clearly written as non-starters. They're obvious non-starters. And they released 2 pre-drafted treaties, which tells you that not only are they asking for things they know they can't get, but more importantly, they're asking for them in a way that will help ensure that they don't get them. I'll tell you why, because serious negotiations are done behind closed doors. Positions are apart quite distantly. It's not uncommon that you start off with 2 very diametrically different positions in negotiation. But it's much rare where one side publishes its entire position, making it very hard for the other side to compromise if you go into negotiation like that. It makes it less likely. So increasingly, why I've been pessimistic all along, and I've seen a number of folks over time have jumped on the pessimism train in terms of the trajectory of this crisis, is that Moscow is much more interested in a formal refusal from the United States, I think, than a compromise. And I know that this is a pessimistic view, but I'm increasingly seeing it head in that direction. When it comes to military options, so I'll outline the main area of disagreement. The problem Russia has with use of force, and why this kind of eliminates most limited scenarios, in some respects, a repeat of 2014, 2015. So the problem Russia's had is has had no way to enforce its preferences in Ukraine. Russia has compelled through force Ukraine to sign 2 agreements, Minsk I, 2014, and second Minsk agreement in 2015, right? And these have gone absolutely nowhere because once these agreements are signed, they are signed at gunpoint, right? They're imposed on Ukraine. Ukrainian society fundamentally vetoes them, and Ukrainian government or Ukrainian administration is not able to know this. Well, Katharine disagrees. Okay, fine. That's fine. Katharine can explain why these agreements have gone nowhere.
Yes, I hope so.
Point being is, look, this hasn't worked for Russia. So why would doing it again a third time achieve that which Russian leadership has not been able to achieve in Ukraine, right? So my view of it is that just compelling Ukraine and hurting the Ukrainian military is not going to achieve anything for Moscow, because as soon as the Russian military withdraws, you know, these agreements are kind of long-time settlements. It takes quite a while to talk about implementation. There's meetings, et cetera, et cetera. All the course of bargaining leverage disappears, right? So now we're looking at much more serious options. And keep in mind, the cost of a Russian intervention are going to be very high. The political economic cost the United States will impose, right? So the risk calculus has to be either they're going to pursue maximalist aims or they're not going to do it. That's the reality of it. And the most likely option for them is try to pursue regime change, try to impose regime change. And most likely they're not banking on the fact that they're gonna have to conduct any substantial occupation. But the second one is to perhaps go for Ukraine's eastern regions, attain a political settlement, and then, here's why I think I overlap more with Rob, tie Russian withdrawal to implementation of the agreement, believing that finally they have much greater leverage to attain that which they couldn't in 2014 and 2015. And I have a kind of outside worst case contingency because it's kind of good to look at, even low probability but very worst cases, which is if they don't get either or, they might even consider partition. But either way, I think the lesson for Russia from 2014, 2015 is whether or not they intend an occupation, and they didn't in the Donbass, if the things don't turn out the way they want politically, they may very well end up occupying and holding territory that they didn't actually plan to originally. And the object of the campaign was not to hold the territory in question. And I think they got that. That's why they're signaling that they actually have the forces prepared for an occupation of some size. Maybe it's just a signal as part of a bargaining towards a final settlement, or most likely it's a plan B because they've learned a lot from the experience of 2014 and 2015. And they realize this might not work out at all the way they planned. In any military operation, it is very difficult to see things beyond the first move. Things are highly contingent in war, right? So it's very hard to kind of plan all this out. All right, so I'll turn it back to you. I hope I don't run my time too much. I'd be actually curious to see where Katharine's disagreement is.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to turn it over to Katharine. You're muted though.
No, I had that response to the line Ukrainian society ultimately vetoes it, just because I'm allergic to the use, to a sort of what I see as a reductive use of the term Ukrainian society, right? Ukrainian society is not the 25% of the voting population who went for Poroshenko in the second round. It's not the people who marched in opposition to the Steinmeier formula in 2019. They're part of Ukrainian society. Many of them are very enlightened and interesting and pleasant members of Ukrainian society, but they're not they're not equivalent to Ukrainian society. They're not the extent of it. As far as public opposition to Minsk, I mean, for sure, opposition to many of the elements of Minsk certainly goes beyond that 25%, no doubt about it. There is large opposition to, say, implementing special status in the way that Russia would like to see it implemented, whereby the separatist entities are basically preserved and pushed back into the Ukrainian polity. But there is, surveys have over the years, they've shown a plurality of people supporting special status in some in some sort of moderate iteration as a tool of conflict resolution, right? So if that ends the war, then yes, we support it. That said, I agree that that the window may have closed if it were ever open to seek a mutually agreeable form of special status. As far as the idea of Russia compelling Ukraine to implement Minsk as according to its vision, I think it's a very it's a scary and interesting theory for sure. It's very hard for me to imagine Russia trying to get Ukraine to implement Minsk now to reincorporate these territories, trying to do that with a straight face, given the extent to which they have basically de facto annexed them by this point. They've violated Minsk. They have all sorts of de facto violations of Minsk going now. For example, they've accepted trade certificates for items produced in the so-called republic, so that sausages being sold in Russia now have labels reading DNR on them. They've done so many things that basically recognize the so-called republics that it's really hard to see Russia again trying to make that argument with a straight face now. But yeah, I agree that could be all the more argument for why they would be trying to coerce Ukraine to take that step at this point. So yeah, no, it's interesting and tricky.
Thank you. Let me turn it back over to Michael and include this question that came directly for you, and it's about will Putin finally agree to NATO's open door policy? What do you think? I think some of this you already brought up, but won't hurt to answer the question. And then I'll turn it over to Rob because we're getting a lot of questions about the compellence strategy as well.
Okay, so first, it's not like Katharine and I are generally in violent agreement, and it's a conversation of terms as to what are the different reasons why successive Ukrainian administrations have not been able to agree. and have chosen not to follow through, or at least not compromise with Russia on the Russian desired approach to implementation of Minsk. I would just like to sort of just briefly restrike the target. I don't think Minsk 2 is the viable solution for this conflict way forward. I don't think Russia thinks so either. Maybe it was at some point for them back in 16, 17, whatnot. But I think we're well past that point. I have colleagues who have argued, consistently that, hey, if we could just get Ukraine to change its position or something else, and then agree to the Russian version of implementation of Minsk 2, we get out. I personally believe that this formula is dead. I don't think this is the Russian approach. I don't think Russia's going to try to compel Ukraine to implement Minsk 2. I think in some ways we're going to be fortunate even if there's a Minsk 3, because I actually expect Russia has a much more maximal solution in mind for Ukraine. And so I'm an even worst case scenario pessimist than some of my other colleagues out there. But well, you can see the argument for that in the War in Iraq piece I wrote, because I actually do think they're angling towards regime change or some other much even larger solution than this, much more costlier, but also with far potential greater benefits for them. Anyway, on the question where NATO open door policy, I don't understand the premise of the question. So Russia's three main things that they're asking in the security guarantee demands. First, no more NATO enlargement, right, to Russia's borders. I mean, obviously it's about Ukraine, but it's even beyond Ukraine, because you can see Finns and Swedes basically looking and say, hey, this looks like it's about me too. Russian veto over aspects of NATO defense cooperation with non-NATO members, key offensive, defensive, strategic capabilities, specific to Ukraine, but also not necessarily just to Ukraine. Again, leads other countries to wonder, what does it mean for them? And three, this clause is kind of the kicker. This will tell you how serious the document is. There's a clause that basically NATO should return military posture and infrastructure to pre-May 1997 lines, which is essentially go back to Germany clause, right? And then when asked, do you just mean Baltics and Poland, or do you also mean NATO infrastructure in Bulgaria and Romania? The Russian MFA answer is, we also mean Bulgaria and Romania. So this gives you a good sense of it. So the only clause that's really missing from the demands is a request for the United States to return Alaska to them, because that may not have made the cut. But I'm of course being a bit facetious, but I'm showing clearly how much of a non-starter these asks are, right? And so folks are then saying, well, we're having meetings, there's good room to compromise, maybe we can move forward on the US counter proposal of an expanded strategic stability dialogue. And I apologize for my immense skepticism on this. I'm not sure I see a there unless Russian leadership really wants to back down with such minimal gains and pay considerable external and some internal audience costs.
Thank you, Michael. I want to ask Rob, we got quite a few questions about just compellence. In your article, you argue how Moscow has switched from deterrence to compellence. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what compellence is, but also you're saying Moscow believes now that Kiev is a hostile enemy, increasing its defense capabilities. That's where I want to ask you a question. How do you assess so far the Western sort of military aid that Ukraine has received at this point, right? That many of the NATO allies are sending aid. Canada has extended its training exercises to 3 years or things like that. But how do you see all these little bits of aid that are coming in so far? And is that, how much do you think that's actually helping Ukraine build up its defenses?
Sure. So if we talk about the most recent military aid, right? So we've seen, Javelins have come from the U.S. for the last 2 years, anti-tank guided missile, effective system, but it's still short range. So it's less than 5 kilometers, depending on which version. The UK has been delivering in-laws, which are even shorter range, and I think systems, but they're cheaper. And then the US has been providing a variety of equipment, so some night vision systems, counter battery artillery, radar, and a few other things. The big thing is that there's clearly a informal limitation of what the US is willing to provide to Ukraine, and I think that's true for most countries. So as Mike mentioned, UK signed a big 1.7 billion agreement this summer, a loan agreement this summer, provide certain ships for Ukraine. Turkey's been building ships for Ukraine. They've also provided these TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles. I don't think the U.S. would have provided any kind of UCAPs. I think they see it as more offensive weapons there's clearly a limitation of what the U.S. is willing to provide, because ultimately I think the U.S. has looked at the conflict and said, we don't want to provide weapons that really could, change anyway alter the balance of power in the Donbass or elsewhere, because the issue is that Russia would likely preempt that. And so the issue right now, with the deliveries, some people have argued about deterrence. I think that's changed. I think at this point, most the U.S. at least thinks that escalation is likely, which means the weapons are now being delivered as a way to raise the costs of an escalation for Russia, as opposed to deter a Russian escalation, because ultimately they won't significantly alter the balance of forces here. They won't significantly alter the outcome of a conflict. They could destroy additional Russian tanks, like Javelins, but ultimately, if Russia decides to escalate, they're gonna cost in or price in certain number of casualties and kind of costs. So they won't make too much of a deal there. I think the one way that they're significant is that some people have argued that Russia's already achieved certain goals by this buildup, and some of that is by forcing NATO to come and talk about stability talks, about security architecture, kind of making to force them to have that kind of conversation. The problem is, since I think it's mostly about Ukraine, there are other things that Mike mentioned. They're right, because it's mostly about Ukraine. Those other things don't solve that issue. And if you look at it from Russia's perspective, Ukraine, as I said, I think Russia now at this point says that there's no good prospects for changing Ukraine's political orientation without forcing NATO members to basically kind of distance themselves from Ukraine, or by basically using Russian military force against them. And so because of that, sorry, I've kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. I don't think. Sorry, really lost my train of thought. So I think that when we look at basically what's happening, because they're concerned that Ukraine political orientation has shifted, they're now focused on Ukraine kind of increasing its defensive capabilities. And what I was saying before, one of the big problems is that what we've seen, at least regarding Ukraine, from NATO since the Russian buildup began, we've seen an increase in arms deliveries. And so if Russia backed down now, the likely lesson that most NATO members would take away was it was this immediate defensive weapons we provided. That's what deterred Russia. And so in the future, we should learn that lesson and continue to do that. So ultimately, from Russia's perspective, the situation got worse, and it's left them even more boxed in regarding Ukraine. So I don't think they're going to change their view on that. And as I was saying before, when Russia looks at Ukraine, because they don't think the orientation is not going to change, and Mike mentioned some of the reasons that ultimately their influence is decreasing. Zelensky is taking measures that by shutting down certain TV channels that'll make it less likely they'll have as much influence in the future. So Russia's main kind of tool of influence in Ukraine is military coercion. It's the threat of military force, coercion, and the risk for them is that if Ukraine's increases defensive capabilities or its conventional deterrence significantly, that means that coercion will probably be less powerful because they'll be able to deter that more in the future. And so if Russia wants to use military force, now is a better time, because if they wait too long, the risk is that Ukraine will develop longer range missiles, and that any kind of incursion in the future might, there'll be more targets within Russia, whether military or civilian, that'll be within range of these kind of missiles or different systems. And the big problem for I think for Russia is that some of this is coming from NATO, but some of this stuff is being developed domestically by Ukraine. So Ukraine's defense industry is developing other these kind of missile systems domestically. So even if NATO comes out and says, okay, we will not provide these kind of weapons, and we will not, let Ukraine into NATO, it doesn't really completely solve the problem for Russia. And so that's what really leads to be pessimistic here, is that Russia either wants to change Ukraine's political orientation or limit their ability to increase their defensive capabilities. And there really aren't good ways of doing that except for using military force, unless someone kind of is cowed by the threat of force. And so far, no one right now is showing that right now. So the prospects aren't great. In terms of compellence, I think someone else kind of defined in the chat box. Basically, deterrence is about trying to tell another country or other countries to not take some certain kind of future action. That if you do something, we will respond a certain way, and it becomes an issue of saying the punishment you receive is not worth it, and we have to demonstrate we have credibility to follow through with that. Compellence is about basically there's a current behavior of a target that you don't like, and you want them to change that. And so in the case of Ukraine, I think part of this is about steps that Zelensky's been taking a counter to Russian interests in Ukraine. they're not, implements agreements. They're not, Zelensky's moves against Novichok and other kind of domestic policies. And two is that they keep increasing their defensive capabilities, and NATO keeps delivering more and more arms. And they see this gradual increase, and basically, nothing they've received so far. TB2s, the big deal made about them. They're not that significant because ultimately the Russian military has methods of countering them. But their concern is we want to preempt this before NATO provides actually strategically significant weapons to Ukraine. And I think they see a gradual increase occurring, and they want to draw a line and stop that now. And so all those reasons, I think basically the prospects aren't very great that we're going to see anything other than military force, because I think Russia's perspective, they think this is the last resort, and that basically there's no way to achieve their goals short of using significant military force at this point. And that's I think with Mike saying I'm quite pessimistic. Everything Russia's signaling right now is that military escalation more likely than not. And I think at this point it's probably more a matter of time than a matter of negotiating changes or any kind of diplomatic solutions.
All right. Well, I'm very sorry this is so grim, but this is what you get when you come to FPRI, right? Sort of, we speak frankly. I want to ask Katharine, when you watch especially the U.S. response, the language that the Western leaders have been using, as the conflict deepens, we've seen the language also become more and more serious, right? It's not every day that you hear, someone like, the President of the United States say, we're prepared for anything. We're hoping for a military solution, but, we're there will be severe consequences, right? So at least, for some of us, there is way more rhetorical support also for Ukraine coming from the West than we've seen before. Is that something that's registering in Ukraine? How do the Ukrainians feel about the support they've been getting from the West in the recent months? And how do you see it? And do you think that it could be better? There could be more that they could be doing.
So in terms of how other people see it, sure, there are sort of Western-leaning, sort of English conversant, anti-corruption activist types, people writing for sort of modern, in some cases, partially Western-funded media, who are certainly, excited about the rhetorical support that they've been getting from the U.S. and especially from Great Britain. Excited about the arms assistance that Great Britain has been providing, and really, contrasting that with Germany's sort of accusatory, measly response in their view. No, lots of stuff about sort of the nation of Churchill once again being on the right side of history. And on the other hand, I would say other, people, I don't want to use the word sort of, more ordinary Ukrainians, but, people who are sort of maybe have less access to elite circles, are possibly more skeptical, sort of, I heard the argument the other day that if the US really wanted to help Ukraine, it would be providing a lot more than Javelins. And the Javelins seemed like a nice sort of symbolic show of support, but ultimately they were just sort of about building up the US's image and in the eyes of Eastern Europeans. I would say, that's a crude way to put it, right? That there's not necessarily that dichotomy between sort of ordinary Ukrainian society and more elite people who are more sort of rah-rah pro-Western support and wanting more. But I would say, that tendency is there to a degree. I certainly haven't heard anyone saying sort of, the West is hanging us out to dry, and, or, you guys are leading us down the road of conflict, those sorts of drastic interpretations. For sure, there is also frustration among some people, and I think you've probably seen it with some members of the Ukrainian government who feel that that Western messaging has been unhelpful and panicky and has been, causing things like, causing potential financial panic and, is going to cause the hryvnia to fall further. And that the West would, if the West really wanted to help Ukraine, they would, they would tamp down the kind of drastic rhetoric a bit, and sort of maybe and acknowledge more, in their view, the degree to which the current danger that Ukraine faces is sort of continuous with the situation that's, that's been in place for the last few years. Whether or not that's true, right? There is that attitude that, that this is nothing out of the ordinary and your panic is just hurting us. Right?
Thank you, Katharine. Michael, I want to combine an audience question with a question that I have also. The question says, has Putin's strategy backfired in that it has pulled the US and Europe together, rather pull them apart, and it has brought them closer to Ukraine? I want to quote a sentence from your article, your recent article. It says, if Ukraine is unfinished business for Putin, then European security should be unfinished business for the United States. And you argue that this is a defining moment for US strategy. How so?
Okay, well, on whether it's pulled us together, it's far too early to tell, right? So in some ways, yes, in other big ways, no. If you watch what's going on between us and Europeans, and also the Ukrainians themselves, that feels like we've pulled together and apart with the Ukrainian interpretation of events, which is the most bizarre aspect of this entire confrontation, is that the United States thinks that Russia's likely going to invade, so does the UK and others, and Ukraine thinks it's not. But we'll put that aside. So it's too early to tell. I don't know. I won't start, patting each other on the shoulder quite yet. It's very clear that there's some significant disagreements, and we'll see when push comes to shove what happens when it comes to implementing sanctions and other things. So there's no way to tell yet. But in the broad strategic picture, yeah, look, fundamentally, the US wants to focus strategy on Indo-Pacific and the competition with China. There was an implicit attempt to see if there was a way to stabilize or park the relationship with Russia kind of on the cheap over the past year. Right? And the administration essentially asked this question: what would it take to stabilize the relationship? Because we wanted to focus on China and on more domestic problems and concerns like COVID. And the Russian price for it was always going to be high. It was going to be quite high in general. And it's also going to be high because the United States signaled quite clearly that Europe is a secondary theater now. Indo-Pacific is the primary theater of US focus and concern. And for US strategy, this begs a big question. European security is unsettled. The principal military power in Europe outside of NATO is not really a stakeholder in European security architecture, right? It is a state with long-standing grievances that wants to be a system determining power in Europe, wants to have a say over security or security arrangements and security outcomes. And the matter is unsettled. That means that we're always going to be one major military crisis away from it potentially escalating into a regional conflict. Because look, the only real state that can destroy the current security order in Europe is Russia, right? If the grievances and disagreements were with Croatia, no offense to friends in Croatia, but it would not threaten the security architecture of Europe. But this clearly does. So we understand that this conflict can entangle other NATO members who are local to the area, right? It can entangle Poland, it can entangle others, and it could become a regional conflict, could become a regional crisis. And yes, that very much then could impinge on European security. My whole point is that the United States will not be able to easily focus on China. And more importantly, this conversation about European security and Europeans stepping up. Well, I'm sorry, it looks like we have differences with Germany. Looks like we have differences with France. The European Union is non-existent, literally just begging to be at the table, right? So we can clearly see that whatever you may think about European capacity, it's very unlikely the Europeans by themselves are going to either be able to deter Russia or lead their way out of a crisis like this, right? So that's self-evident, at least based on how this is playing out. That's my personal view. Yeah, and my whole point of that is basically we're taking a lot of things in European security for granted, and we should take a harder look at that and see that that's going to remain a priority for the United States, and so will Russia as a persistent problem set.
Thank you so much. I have a really good question for Katharine that came in from Eilish Hart. Are we seeing preparations for the potential humanitarian impact of a military escalation from Ukrainian officials or the international community, as well as in the uncontrolled territories of the Donbas region?
No, thank you for that question. I would say not really. I mean, in Kiev, there have been attempts to sort of dust out bomb shelters and, make clear, sort of update the maps as to where they are. There's some disagreement as to how thorough these efforts have been, or sort of how meticulous they've been. Again, I think, as I said at the beginning, when it comes to the uncontrolled parts of Donbass, from what we're hearing, there really no such efforts are visible, which perhaps could indicate that these authorities who are beholden to Russia have a reason to expect whatever escalation occurs to happen somewhere else. Again, whether or not an escalation, whether or not the sort of what some people see as the impending escalation were to occur on what is currently the front line in Donbass, it would be nice to see some measures or some contingency plan in place to relocate civilians, which is something that neither side has seen fit to do for the past 8 years, despite the fact that there are about maybe 500,000 people living along the contact line. There are, granted, there are fewer than there were before, so an effort to relocate people could be possibly a bit logistically simpler than it might have been in previous years. But I haven't seen any signs of that. As far as other humanitarian preparations, that's something that, I've been talking to some of my colleagues about that, and I think there are preparations underway, but it's not clear how confident people feel necessarily about, about their ability to predict what's going to need to happen if and when the time comes, just given that there's so many variables in place.
Right. I really appreciated on Twitter, you shared the video about whether or not the Ukrainians are stocking up on food. And it seemed like there was a lot less panic than some people think from the outside. So that was quite insightful. I think we stocked up on more supplies during the onset of the pandemic, right? It just also tells you how conditioned people are on the ground. With this sort of constant crisis conditions, right?
Yeah. Food prices have also been rising here a lot lately, actually, on both sides of the line. So, that's another deterrent to stocking up on food. Right?
That's another thing, right? When they ask questions like that, right? Can people afford to stock up on food in countries like that? That's another question that we don't really think much about from over here. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to just pose this one last question to Rob, which came in. It says, given the outlook that you have, the pessimistic outlook that you have, dare I ask, what can be said, how much is known about the effectiveness of the Javelin against the upgraded Russian T-72s? So.
Sure. So, Javelin should still be effective. So a number of Russian tanks have developed different countermeasures for anti-tank guided missiles. We haven't necessarily seen those tested in real conditions. Obviously, until you see it in real conditions, there's always a bit of a question about how effective they'll be. I think Javelins will likely be effective. But again, it depends how Javelins are employed, depends how well the guys are trained on them. A lot of soldiers probably don't have that much training. Javelins are very expensive missiles. I think it's like $80,000 a missile. So even the U.S. military, most Javelin operators, don't actually ever fire a Javelin during their careers. It's mostly just on kind of training systems. So there's a lot of important aspects about that. Part of it too is how they're employed just in terms of broader tactics, techniques, procedures. A lot of that kind of stuff decides how effective are weapon systems. If they use piecemeal, it often negates how effective they can be. If you use them kind of effectively, it's kind of a combined operation, they become more effective. So there's still a lot of questions, but one of the big questions for me is depending on what Russia decides to do, they decide to go into cities. That makes Russian forces much more vulnerable to shorter range systems, to anti-tank guided missiles. If they stay out of cities, it will be a little more difficult for Ukrainian forces to target them because Russia has such an advantage in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, UAVs, and fires capabilities. And so, that's going to be one of the big questions of whether or not they go in the cities or not. But, there are a huge number of risks. I expect Javelins to still be effective if they're used properly, but, I don't think it's going to change the kind of, alter the outcome of conflict if Russia does decide to invade.
Thank you, Rob. I would like to thank our panelists, Katharine, Quinn-Judge, Michael Kofman, Rob Lee. Thank you for joining me today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for right now. I would like to thank our audience for joining us and encourage you to keep an eye on our website, fpra.org, sign up for our emails, follow us on social media, because we're going to keep on talking about Ukraine and covering this crisis in the coming days and weeks. So thank you everyone for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.